There you go. Okay.
Okay. It's asking me something here.
It wants your permission.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I was born in the Washington D.C. Grew up just outside of Washington D.C. In Bethesda, Maryland, where the Naval Hospital is. Uh, uh, I kind of describe everything about my family is just a little weird for the early 1960s when I was born. Um, uh, my parents are a mixed race couple. My father's Japanese and my mother's from Western Pennsylvania, which is its own story. Um, there was quite a bit of age difference between them. My father was pushing 40 when he got married. My mother was 22, I think.
Wow.
And it just kind of weird. Well, my mother, both my parents are scientists. My father's a physicist, and my mother was a physicist. My mother's a chemist, which is kind of weird at that time to have a woman scientist. And they were liberal Republicans, which is sort of a breed that died.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was born, I said I was born in that area. Had a fairly normal growing up until I went to school. I don't know if I was ever diagnosed with anything specific, but I apparently have some sort of learning disability. And what happened was, up until about the third grade, I was just considered one of the dumbest students in the class. You know, it was just like, my we had this thing called the shoo train in kindergarten. I don't know if they do this at other places where it's it's a train thing up on the wall, and you get your little pictures in it as you learn to tie your shoes. And I was the last one. And I think I might be dyslexic because one of my problems is I have problems with left and right.
Yeah.
And so I took me a long time to learn how to read. Yeah. And everybody just sort of accepted that until in third grade, they started giving us these standardized tests. And turned out that I had one of the highest scores in America on that test in the third grade.
Wow.
So suddenly I was like being examined by all sorts of people. I was being called out of class to talk to various people from colleges and universities and stuff like that.
Oh my.
And I was being told, yeah, you're one of the smartest people in the country. It's like, well, okay, that's not what you were telling me a couple months ago.
How smart are you? If
right. Right. So, I was starting to get some, help with that. But then starting in the fifth grade, they decided to do an experiment where they basically knocked down all the partition walls in the school and had these big learning bays, and we had these centers that at the time that the top technology was cassette players that had like that could advance film reels. What do you call? What were those called?
Film strips.
Film strips.
Yeah, I remember that. You and I are about the same age. I remember these fads in education.
Yeah, I think I'm a couple months older. I was born in August of '62.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I wasn't the only one, but basically learning stopped at that point because I mean it was a nice experiment, but most of the teachers didn't know what they were doing. And anytime you introduce new technology, I suspect what happens is that the kids are able to pick it up faster than
Yep.
the adults.
Yeah.
Um, but I lucked out and in sixth grade got a teacher who really sort of took an interest in me and got me on the path to uh, struggling through reading. And it's still a struggle for me to read, but it takes me a very long time to read anything. Um, so I by that point I lost interest in school. I was participating a lot in scouts and I played soccer, which was also kind of a unique thing in the early 70s. Um, I the neighborhood I grew up in was extremely diverse because it was favored. It was an area that was favored by a lot of technocrats, including people who worked for international organizations. So we had people from around the world living in our neighborhood, which is why we ended up playing soccer because a lot of these kids who came from other countries didn't know anything about baseball or football. Um, so yeah, and I describe it as a diverse neighborhood, but so we were diverse racially, diverse. We had a lot of different religions. We had a lot of different ethnicities, but basically everybody there was some sort of technical professional. A lot of people had gone to colleges. So we were diverse on certain lines and absolutely unified on other lines. Um, so I made it through junior high school and high school as kind of just a mediocre. I got mediocre grades in there, and part of me suspects that the only reason I didn't fail was that some of the teachers were afraid that that this prodigy was it would reflect bad on them to fail me. Um, so and the other thing that happened in high school was I ended up I went to a United Methodist church growing up. Somehow I ended up on our conference council of youth ministries. So a conference in the United Methodist Church is basically a statewide organization. And ended up on being a youth representative on a jurisdictional board. And so jurisdiction is basically that was the Northeast jurisdiction. So it's basically New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. And I had some thoughts of going into the ministry, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do when I went to college. So I majored in philosophy. Really, by the end of my freshman year, I realized I wasn't going to be a minister. I just didn't have those kind of pastoral tools. And part of that was realizing that I had inherited. So my father was a very distant person. I inherited that from him, of sort of keeping people at arm's length, and actually sort of, I would almost say it's a fear. It's almost a phobia.
Hmm.
And it's not agoraphobia. I'm not that way with strangers. It's people I actually know. So I realized that I would not make a very good pastor. So I ended up going through college. I became sort of fascinated by creativity. So my philosophy degree, I ended up, not only did I have a philosophy degree, what I really specialized in was aesthetics, and questions around, what is creativity, what, what is the what are the relationships between, say, creativity and invention, and creativity and discovery. Um, so, and a part of that pursuit, I ended up um, qualifying for a number of minors. What I probably should have done would have been to go and get a second major, but I wasn't actually interested in doing that. So I qualified for minors in religion, art, and music, and business, because at the end of my sophomore year, I realized I had better get some real skills.
College is going to end.
Yeah, so I ended up taking a bunch of concentrating on accounting, because the other thing that in college, in high school, that kept me uninterested in school was I had joined a Explorer post that met at the David Taylor Research Center, which is a naval research center in Potomac, Maryland, and learned to program computers. Yeah, and so once again, this is the early 70s. So I sort of kept that as a hobby on the side, as the college opened their computer center to people who weren't computer majors or math majors. I was able to get in there and play around some. So I lucked out when I graduated. I was able to basically put that hobby together with these accounting classes. And this was the late 80s by this point. And this is when small businesses started to buy computers.
Yep.
And the way I describe my career is, for 20 years, I found people who bought things but weren't quite sure what to do with them. And
there's a lot of those people.
So I helped them, find useful things to do with them. And it started with computers, and then one of the people I got a job with had been sold a bunch of networking equipment, so I figured out how to make that work. And a lot of my career was basically people asking me, could I do something, and my answer would be, yeah, I could figure that out. So that's what I got into websites when sort of in the mid '90s. Wrote one of the early e-commerce programs. Then I got tired of, and during this time I became a refugee from the city. I just decided I had to leave, leave the city. So I went to work for a rafting company running their internet operations.
Rafting. What kind of rafting is done on the East Coast?
Whitewater rafting.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Because we
Yeah,
got plenty of it out here in the West.
Right. Right. So in West Virginia, there are a couple rivers that get rafted. The one most people know about is the New, and the other one is the Gauley.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
And then there are other rivers around the area, around the region of the Appalachian region that
interesting
are raftables. And at one point, the company, we ran 5 different rivers. So yeah, but anyway, after that job, I got tired of trying to explain to people that you could trust a philosophy major to run your computers, and went back and got a degree in management information systems. And out of that, I ended up starting work for a contractor at NASA, and I'm doing, we do what's called independent verification and validation, which is we basically check the software to make sure it works right.
Yeah, I can see how that's an important field, because we're increasingly trusting the signals we're getting from our machines, but the systems are getting so complex to know that you're getting good data, I would imagine, isn't always obvious. So
Mm-hmm. So on another track, as far as religion is concerned, after I decided I wasn't a minister, I I actually wrote a paper for a psychology of religion class talking about how the American civil religion had changed from patriotism to a kind of pop psychology. And sort of became that sort of got me to look at, in particular, the United Methodist Church, but you know, the mainline church in general, and become somewhat disillusioned. And then I became very interested in the Eucharist and sacraments, and ended up going to a Episcopal church for a while in college. But you know, the nice, cozy Episcopal church in a small college town is a lot different from college Episcopal churches in suburban Maryland.
yeah.
So was never able to find another church home there, and sort of fell into a kind of, I've never really been an atheist, but just kind of a nihilism. So
Was that because you didn't have a community that sort of was able to hold you, and so you just sort of drifted and were alone?
yeah, I think a lot of it was that. A lot of it, and I kind of can retroactively look back and say, it's a lot of that paper about pop psychology becoming civil religion um, was about churches, local parishes becoming seeing themselves as social institutions rather than as communities. And the more I look back on the history of that time, I think I was onto something.
I think you were very much so.
Um,
That's a great insight.
and a lot of what I've been thinking about recently is this trying to separate community and society, and the fact that you know that those two terms at some point become synonymous. Um, and that's kind of why I'm looking to reapproach the church. But I also have the difficulty of, okay, so step back to my childhood. One of the weird things about my childhood was my grandmother went to both a Presbyterian church and a Buddhist temple.
I don't know that it's so weird with Japanese.
Right. But, practices sort of pure Buddhism.
Right.
So I've always been interested in Buddhism. So I've never, I visited a monastery once, but I've never really pursued actually trying Buddhist practices. But actually, John Vervaeke got me thinking back to what I've learned about Buddhism in various forums, and how that fits in. And one of the three refuges that Buddhists will talk about, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, and I take refuge in the Sangha. And Sangha roughly is an assembly. It's right. Sort of the community of Buddhists.
Right.
So one of the things I've been doing recently is going through the site that's translating all of the Buddhist literature, Buddhist scriptures, if you want to call them that, looking to see what Buddhism teaches about community. Because in academic circles, you don't really learn about the practical part of Buddhism. Right. You learn about the kind of more, the metaphysics and epistemology of Buddhism.
Right. And that's interesting, because that practice of the academy has, has shaped the appearance and sort of self-understanding of all religious traditions. And I suspect that so in Sacramento has a fairly large Japanese community. I've had members of my church I've had Japanese members of my church in the past. They passed away not too long ago. The Japanese culture is a fascinating thing. And then the relationship between the Japanese and Buddhism is also interesting. It's interesting that your grandmother was a member of both, and that doesn't surprise me, given my experience with, Japanese in Sacramento. It's an amazing, this couple in my church, they were some of the most giving, wonderful, faithful people. But as you said, quite, You know, they were always ready to care for others, but when it came time to receive care, they and their family had this little circle around them, and no, we'll take care of ourselves, thank you, and we
Mhm.
appreciate your concern. But and you know, and I wonder too about, I think in the medieval world, a lot of community could be simply be assumed because community was so completely necessary for basic survival. And part of what happens in the modern nation state is that this so many things that community used to provide organically now sort of gets institutionalized, and this has deeply impacted churches, of course. But I would imagine it's funny because down in Stockton, just town south of us, there's a road that goes through, and right next to that road, there's a building that says Buddhist Church. And I always drive past that and I think that's such an interesting cultural appropriation for the immigrants to say, you know, it's not the Sangha, it's the church. Now, on one hand, it's a very legitimate translation, but
Mhm.
and so your insights and your comments on this, I find quite interesting and perceptive.
Right, right. The problem is, for me is, I live in Fairmont, West Virginia now, so we don't really have a particular, there are no temples or
You
monasteries
you
around.
abandoned the city, so that's in America where you're
Yeah,
going to find these
that's on me.
populations.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Um, but and I doubt that I would make a very good Buddhist because I'm way too Western. Um, and but in trying to reapproach the church, um, I don't know if what I believe is Christian. I can play mental games and say, yeah, I actually can honestly recite, you know, the Nicene or the Apostles' Creed, but I don't mean the same word.
Yeah,
I'm,
yeah,
I don't mean the same thing that you all do mean
yeah,
by it.
yeah.
Um, um, I guess my theology, to the extent that I have one, um, there are a handful of biblical verses that I take literally. Um, and I'm pretty sure they're all either in the Gospel or the Epistles of John. Um, one is that God is love. Um, and the other is, um, so in the story of Lazarus, when Jesus tells Mary or tells Martha, I am the resurrection, I actually take that literally. Um, I assume that to whatever extent I manifest God's love or I channel God's love or however you want to put it, I am resurrected with Christ. So Paul would say, forget the exact verse, and it says that as we've died with Christ in baptism, so we rise with Him, or are risen with Him. He seems to use the present tense there.
Yeah.
He doesn't say we're going to be risen with Him. We are
Right.
risen with Him.
Right.
So, you know, I believe that, even though it's a mystery that I really can't wrap my head around. I can't intellectually say that.
Yeah.
The other thing I kind of need to straighten out is one of the things in Buddhism that I actually do believe is the idea of anatma, the no self. That it's too simplistic to say that the self is an illusion. It's just that it's not permanent. So I don't actually believe in that my consciousness or whatever I am, it will survive death. That what is resurrected is, like I said, the expression of God's love through me. You know, to whatever extent I let that happen. And most, when I do have approached churches in the past couple of years, once I get to that point, it's good. They're kind of like,
they don't know what to do.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit the formula.
No. There's in churches, there's a dilemma in that often people in your situation will, you're sort of left to, let's say, a liberal church, where the liberal church is so completely wide open. They could hear that and say, oh, that's fine. But the problem with the liberal church is that they are so completely wide open, they don't tend to be able to hold much or do much. And it's this weird, I remember at times feeling myself sort of frustrated and a little pinned in by certain aspects of my own denomination and thinking, oh, what if I joined a liberal denomination? They don't seem to care what anybody thinks. I can think what I want and say what I want and they'd all be fine. And then I figured out, not exactly really either. So it is sort of a misfits dilemma.
Right. And yeah, and it drives me back because my girlfriend has expressed interest in going to the Unitarian Universalist Church nearby.
Yeah.
And I don't really feel inclined to do that because it gets back to that whole thing about society and communities.
Yes.
That they very much see themselves as a social institution.
Yes.
Right? They in straight out talk about transforming society.
And they tend to be possessed by various pop psychological fads that go through. You just watch them go through all the fads.
Right.
You're very right. You're very right.
But the mainstream churches around here, aren't any better. And the more conservative churches, this idea that I don't believe in how they see the resurrection, that I don't believe in a personal afterlife. Tends to I guess it boils down to their whole idea of salvation is salvation from hell. But I don't see that as a kind of issue.
Right.
I've never really thought too much about hell as opposed to to just kind of the torments of life.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the reasons I hesitate in having this recorded is I'm likely to say something that gets me in trouble every now and then. I mean, literally gets me at one point had me put away, which is I don't particularly like being live.
Hmm.
That doesn't, and people hear that and automatically assume that that's a suicidal ideation. It's just
No, I don't think that's I've spoken to a
it's
lot of suicidal people. That's not how they sound.
right.
You're talking in a certain register that's not what they're talking in.
It's close to an aesthetic judgment.
Yes. Yes.
So, I'm sort of there. I'm looking for community. I'm trying to start an estuary, but I can't really explain to anybody around here what that is. And I don't have the backing of a church to do anything about it.
Oh man. Oh.
But I really like the idea of estuary. It's just
Yeah.
When I'm on the leaders Zoom meetings, it's very helpful to be able to talk out some things.
Yeah. There's a lot, we've, the estuary project is, it is on one hand, you're not the first person to tell me what you've just told me. And even online, it's better than not having it at all. But, it would be nice to have one in real life where you, in fact, would have, the beginnings of a community.
Right. I see it as the starting of a community of, for lack of a better phrase, spiritual but not religious people.
Yeah.
Which is a category I definitely put myself in.
Yeah.
But because I mean, one of the things listening to you and other people in this quarter has done is challenge my epistemological nihilism of maybe this whole thing about powers and principalities is there's something to that. That there are, for lack of better phrasing, higher agencies that we participate in. Which circles all the way back to the whole society versus community thing. That the spirits that control society are I tell people when so occasionally, particularly when I was back getting my second degree, I would take classes. The fact that it's a second degree gave me a lot of leeway to take all sorts of weird classes. And so some of the classes I took were kind of in these social justice, these new disciplines of social justice. And one of the things that sort of got out of that is people, when people say society doesn't care about this or that group, it's like, yeah, I know society doesn't care about anybody. Society isn't about caring. Society is about keeping order.
Yes.
Community is about caring.
Yes.
And for some reason, America has let community be subsumed by by society. And the way I put it is that the things that communities should be doing, when they do them right, they're wholesome. And when society takes over, they're totalitarian, because they're not done with care. Like I said, it's the point I disagree with Christian spiritual warfare people is that I don't necessarily believe that the powers and principalities are demonic. It's like they're just doing what they're supposed to do. Right. I'm sure to the lamb that gets away from the flock, the little Shetley, the little herding dog is a demonic spirit.
Hello. Hello for riding car.
Sorry.
That's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. So, I agree that there is this kind of spiritual warfare, and I don't see it quite the same way.
Right. Well, it's part of. So I've talked before about the excluded middle, and missionaries coming from Western countries to the rest of the world saw this immediately, that most cultures in the world had a middle of spirits. And what tended to happen was sometimes all of those spirits were categorized as demonic. But not all those spirits were evil. And this is where say the medieval perspective, and I think part of the reason that the new fascination in a medieval perspective is rising right now is because you realize that they weren't all evil and they weren't always good, that there was a middle realm, and different biblical scholars have worked on that with respect to a variety of Michael Heiser wrote about that quite a bit when he was alive. The heavenly hosts. And there tended to be just this radical binary that happened. There's angels and demons. Okay, that's it. So there's God, angels, demons, Christians. There it is, done. And it's like, it's especially in the sense that you can fairly, now with these hyper objects, which is sort of a secularized neutral term, let's say. I don't particularly like the term, but we're really struggling with respect to the problem with language isn't just, gosh, how to talk about this stuff. Naming always involves being able to point to something. And the difficulty we're having is that it's difficult to point to things that people can see. So no, go ahead. If you've got to deal with something, go ahead.
Okay. It's not in the box. You might check in my car. Okay. At least that red one is there. Okay.
Sorry.
It's fine.
My girlfriend wants to take the dog for a walk.
Oh, wonderful. This stuff is so hard. I mean, again, just seeing the Peugeot James Lindsay recent, James Lindsay has no idea what Jonathan Peugeot is talking about. And so James Lindsay then is just sort of dismissing everything, which is just this classic sort of modern move. And Protestants do it. And, basically secularists do it because it's a version of Protestantism. It's just, we're just going to sweep all this away. But then they fall prey to things like pop psychology, which are just kind of other versions of it without the idea of agency. So we're in a position right now where it's terribly difficult to manage this stuff. And there's no, so when recently when Peugeot talked to Benjamin Boyce And Port Benjamin was trying to sort of make some progress in this area. And I have to re-listen to it because I listen to it at night and then I fall asleep to things I don't hear at all. But it's just so hard for Peugeot, I think, to make himself understood. This stuff is so hard. Well,
Right.
maybe it's a good thing we have hard things because then we have stuff to do, I guess.
Right. And the thing that I keep coming back to is that we're kind of fighting in this social arena. And I mean, one of the things that brought me to this corner was David Fuller and his project that he shut down a while ago.
Rebel Wisdom, yeah.
Yeah, the Rebel Wisdom project, and talking about sense making, which, as a philosopher, is something I could sort of sink my teeth into. That was something I could wrap my head around. And when I hear people talk about, say, artificial intelligence, I mean that's absolutely a sense making problem. And the best place to make sense would be in a community rather than trying to do it at a societal level.
Yes.
And I think that the Peugeot Lindsay thing is are people sort of trapped in this societal arena. And at the end of that Benjamin Boyce interview with Peugeot, he was saying, he basically his go to church message, that this needs to be done at that community level, or I don't know about level, but within that community venue.
Well, and here again, I really love how you've you've really given me some insight here into differentiating society and community. I think that's a super helpful distinction. And society is a hyper object that has some significant differences from the thing that is community. Community, or real community, is always an instantiated thing, where society is much more this hyper object, which is sort of out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think your observation is dead on correct, that part of the problem between Peugeot and Lindsay. So I might rip this off for a video. So, and depending on how much you want to stay anonymous, I won't name you, but you do get credit for it, because I had this insight listening to you talk, because really I think you're dead on right, that the answer to Lindsay and Peugeot understanding each other lies much more in being within a community rather than staying at this societal level, because you're not, and Vervaeke is right, there's lack of affordance there, because right. they're limited to this bandwidth up here, and there's something that happens in community. It doesn't mean that society, that Peugeot and Lindsay would sort of they completely understand each other. No, but that kind of community is a venue in which that sort of understanding begins to occur. It's sort of like C.S. Lewis and I can't think of his name, his second friend, the Barfield, yes. It's like Lewis and Barfield. It was in community that they could begin to understand each other. Without that community, they're Peugeot and Lindsay will just tend to be two battleships that are lobbing shells at each other, because those shells are just the videos or the words going back and forth. There's not going to be any coming together.
Right, and Benjamin Boyce actually seems to be attempting that. He seems
Yes.
to be attempting to bring them into the same community.
Yes.
Whether he will ultimately be able to do that, I'm not sure. But and a lot of it is just style, and as Lindsay's style as opposed to Peugeot's style.
Yeah.
They're both very set in their worldviews.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And I don't know if they'll be able to see each other's worldview.
Yep. Yeah. I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah. But your question, your challenge is a difficult one. And this is this is in some ways the estuary challenge, which is helping actually found communities and helping people find each other.
Right.
And build these.
And you actually found somebody I should be asking to be part of the estuary. So I don't know if it was last week or maybe it was 2 weeks ago. You quoted a woman, a Muslim woman from Morgantown, West Virginia, talking about her family. I should know that family.
Huh. Interesting.
So I think she would be interesting to include. I actually know her parents better than I know her, but
oh, these are the hiders?
At
because I haven't talked to too many Muslim women.
No, you didn't talk to her. You quoted a tweet of hers.
Oh,
you
her.
You showed
yeah.
a picture.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I just found that tweet sort of randomly. Well, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's having people want to do something that costs, having Americans want to do something that costs them time is a tremendously difficult thing. You can get money out of them far easier than you get time out of them, because again, it's what I noticed. Haitians had more time than money, and Americans had more money than time. And especially when it comes to community, I mean, part of the reason the country is struggling is that we have decided community is not worth our time, because partly it is so costly. Community is tremendously costly in terms of time. And so we're very zealous of guarding it.
Right. And that's part of the reason why I keep asking you about Luke 16. Keep mentioning it when I throw questions your way on the Discord.
Which part of Luke 16?
Use your money to make friends.
Oh, I just finished talking with Chad, and he asked me what my favorite Bible verse was, and I started talking about Luke 16. So it's amazing that you bring that up.
Yeah, and by that I take it to mean, build a community, make friends, build a community. Because if your cheating ways get you in trouble, they will look out for you. Because I can relate to the steward who says, who ends up getting fired and was wondering, what am I going to do? I'm too proud to beg, and I'm too lazy to dig ditches. And I did. I'm a prime example of what you talk about with Americans. It's like, yeah, I'm a systems engineer, who gets paid, pretty penny, but I have pretty modest, a pretty modest lifestyle. So I have I have the resources to help people out, and I do, but because my the first time I asked you a question about that was like trying to balance Luke 16 and Matthew 6. So in Matthew 6, it says, don't blow trumpets when you give to the poor.
Right.
And I was like, okay, I want it to be effective, but I would, I also have some certain ulterior motives in my giving.
For all of my interest in that parable, I have done very little contemplating on 16 verse 9. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. That is a very straightforward verse. Mm-hmm. And I'd never sort of thought about it in that way. But and you're right, and sort of in contrast with Matthew 6. It's very interesting.
Right. And the Taoist in me wants to find some sort of balance between those two.
Yeah. That's just a plain, simple admonition that Jesus gives there. And in fact, he seldom, this is the crazy thing. I mean, I have been for 60 years, I've been involved in churches, listening to sermons. Now, obviously, the church is vast, and you only just ever participate or see just a slice of it. But I can't ever recall ever hearing any clergy make any admonishments about that verse. And there it is. It's just a straightforward verse. It's very plain and simple. And you just sort of contextualized it and applied it. And I thought, well, and it's also, for in your case too, it's also sort of interesting in juxtaposition to how do you understand heaven, eternal dwellings, given your skepticism about afterlife.
I think that in this case, giving would be one of those manifestations of God is love that I spoke about earlier. I don't want to use the word theosis, but becoming like God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that love is what will remain. That love is what is resurrected with Christ.
Yeah.
I said earlier that I was interested in the Eucharist. One of the things that I developed going to the Episcopal Church in when I was in college, was this idea that in taking the Eucharist, I'm not so much consuming the body of Christ as being consumed by the body of Christ, the resurrected body of Christ. And how that relates to the church is another thing, but the church as the body of Christ.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
And there is an element of the church there, because in the Eucharist, you see yourself as participating in a tradition that goes back to the early church.
Yeah.
So the idea of being consumed by that was a very strong part of sort of adjusting to leaving the mainstream church.
Well, you've given me a lot to chew on, Neal.
It's like a lot of times when I'm listening to you, when on your podcast, and that's how I listen to you. I only go on YouTube if I want to actually make a comment.
Right.
Otherwise, I just listen to the podcast when it comes out. It's like, wow, I wish I could ask him this question here. and every now and then it drives me to Discord to actually put it in your Q&A. But
well, now you can text me, which is a lot better.
Right.
That's and that's part of the reason for the different levels.
Right. I guess what the one final thing is, I keep saying I want to have, part of reapproaching church is to have a truth and reconciliation process, and that's like understanding, trying this rethinking of my nihilism, my deconstructing my nihilism, as it were, as I have to understand, I have to try to discover certain truths about myself, and I've mentioned a couple of those that I've come to in the past, couple of years since I started this process. But I also wanted to know, are the things I think about the church true? And I know they're not, but what nuggets of truth are there in the things that I think about the church?
Yeah, it's difficult because in some ways the church is always this big thing out there, and when I listen to your dilemma, I don't find it inconceivable that you could find a local church and a relationship with a minister where you might never be on the church council if it's a confessional church, because you've got, it's sort of John Van Donk situation. John Van Donk is not going to be on the council of Cross Point Church. It's not going to happen because he's got certain ideas that just don't fit in with the confessional package. But he is a part of that community. If you're around him in that church, he is a part of that community. And so part of what I think we're going to be sorting out over the next 100 years is going to continue to be this question of these propositional beliefs and the other 3 Ps. And this is sort of what's at stake in the Christian Reformed Church right now as an institution. But even though I am a member of the Christian Reformed Church, even in Christian Reformed polity, I'm actually a member of this Christian Reformed Church. And there's the denomination recognizes the tension between those two things. And so I don't find it inconceivable that you could find a church. Now, that doesn't mean it's possible. It's just not inconceivable that you could find a church where you could participate in the community, because I've known lots of people that have participated in even traditional conservative churches that have had participants who have very different belief systems, but they're very much a member of that church, even if they don't necessarily share all the propositions that the church shares. And the church sort of understands that, and the people understand that, and that goes fine. And if, the mainliners in some ways want to let go of propositions, but they also then don't understand sort of, those 4 P's are together for a reason. You don't just sort of cut the 1 and the 3 apart. They are always together. And so we're always wrestling between them. And I think estuary in some ways does that well. And John Van Donk's estuary group is really flourishing, and it'll be interesting to me to see how, once I go week to week with estuary, what happens with that group and what that group becomes, especially alongside of this other confessional church that is, sort of withering. But so I don't know. And because I think it's conceivable that you can find community in a church, because I've seen it happen. There have been people in my church. I've been lots of people in my church that I, as a pastor, because they will tell me what they really believe. They won't say it necessarily to the whole group. They'll just kind of keep their mouth shut. But because they trusted me, they would say, well, Pastor, I think this, and this. And I know where that stands with respect to all kinds of other things, and I'll hold it in confidence. But they still were fully part of the church. And the church lived fine with that. Like John Van Donk. Church lives fine. When John Van Donk says, I want to have a conference that'll bring in 200 strangers into our building and occupy it for 3 days, and I think this would be pretty good for the church too. He talked the church into it, and they all agreed. And at the end of it, everyone was happy with each other. And they know what a crazy guy Van Donk is. They live with him. So it's not inconceivable, but I think you're exactly right with respect to the differentiation between society and community, that the reason John Van Donk is a part of that community is partly because he came in and they knew he needed them, and they learned they needed him too in time. And that's what happens in community, where you can have, it's the whole dynamic of, well, he's a heretic, but he's our heretic.
Okay.
And John's willing to live with that. And they are too. So I think your instincts are 100% correct. It's just that this is what I tell people with respect to churches. I say, if you want to get in, just keep coming. Because churches are like animals, in that someone visits a church once and they all look at them and are like, there's a visitor. Then the church is kind of like, well, we wonder if they'll stay, and then they usually think maybe they'll tithe, maybe they have status, yada, yada. Churches think about all those instrumental things first. Okay. That's the first few weeks. But if the person keeps coming and is part of that community, very, very seldom do churches tell people don't come back. Churches almost never do that. Churches will get accustomed to the person, no matter how crazy, no matter how, and in time, once that community dynamic happens, many churches, not all, there's some churches that will eventually say, we don't want this person here, and they'll kick him out. But many churches in time will just basically make a place for that person, despite, as long as they're not, hurting people in the church or something like that. They'll be a part of that community. Happens all the time. So I guess I just encourage you on that. If you, it would be important to kind of pick a church that has that capacity to do it well. And Dutch churches aren't bad choices for that, because the Dutch, in their cultural tradition, have a strong tradition of tolerance, which means that they might be doctrinaire in many ways, but they've also got this instinct for tolerance and toleration. So
Yeah. Unfortunately, I actually did go looking for CRC churches, and there
There
isn't
aren't
one
many
within
by you.
about 75 miles of here.
Yeah, no, there's not that many of them. They're not distributed evenly over the United States, I'll say it that way.
Right.
But no, but there could be others. Anglicans might be a place to look to, because they tend to, but they have to, yeah, it's hard. I'm so lucky in that I don't have a choice of where to go to church. I'd go here anyway. But I feel really bad for church shoppers, because it's really hard to find a place to fit in.
Right. And that's one of the things I gave up to become a urban refugee,
Yeah.
or refugee from the urban area, which is kind of a discussion of its own, but why I did that. But yeah, is that that there isn't quite the variety of spiritual institutions around here.
Yeah. I guess I'll have to start a cult in a compound somewhere, so all the misfits can move to some place in rural California with really good internet. And where's my Moscow, Idaho?
Right. And that's actually one of the things I've been thinking about. I've been sort of mentally setting up discussions with. So I I I I listened a lot to things in this little corner, but I also listened to a lot to. Somehow I got to listening to the Modern War Institute's podcasts. The Modern War Institute is a think tank up at West Point, the military academy. And I find a lot of parallels in there. And one of them is so the church and the military are two places that create communities, for lack of a better word, in the military. I don't know if that's the right word, but for the military, that are in tension with the society. But one of the things they share is that in order to not be a cult, you're connected to a higher doctrine. So doctrine is a big word in the military.
Yeah.
And you're almost in an AA way. You're connected to a higher power.
Yeah.
And that keeps you from that keeps the leadership from going off into this sort of cult territory. Doesn't always work, but
Yeah.
It's one of the guardrails that would have to be blasted through to actually get to the cult territory.
Wow. Well, Neal, definitely, you have my cell phone number. That's kind of the whole purpose of this. So keep the ideas coming. And I'm glad you're in LSNET, and I'm glad you have that. But gosh, I wish I had I recorded this. What I'll do is I put it unlisted, and then I'll send you the link, and then nobody else sees it. Anybody, though, the only people that can see it have the link, and you and I are the only ones with the link. And then we can talk about it and see what we want to do. But you've given me so many interesting ideas. Modern War Institute podcast. Wow, I'd never even heard of it.
Yeah. So there's the Modern War Institute podcast. The ones I listen to in particular are one called The Spear, which is I'm in my conversations you would be partnered up with the host of this program, because what the Spear is stories about the combat experience, personal
Huh.
stories about the combat experience. So it's, his first question is very similar to yours, which is, his first question is, how did you join the Army, or how did you come to join the Army? Or, he interviews people from other services also, but how did you come into the military? And the other one is the Urban Warfare podcast, which is that was my entry point, because one of the things I did when I went back to school was I sort of made it an education in globalization, and I realized that globalization is actually just urbanization. The world is becoming urban, and the Urban Warfare podcast is one of the few shows that is actually sort of taking a practical look at what that means.
Crap. It's like I didn't need more content in my life, Neal. Now it's like, oh, you're colonizing me.
Yeah, and also I would be interested in your opinion on the movie I suggested in your last Discord Q&A, which was 10,000 Saints. I think you'd find that interesting, because if nothing else, because it's about somebody coming of age in the 80s.
58% Rotten Tomatoes. Taking this on faith.
Yeah. Oh, I could see that a lot of people don't like it, but I think it's a very interesting. I thought it was a very interesting movie.
Maybe I can get my wife to watch it.
And as far as the theme of searching for a spiritual, or a quest for a spiritual home, definitely it sort of gives a lot of discussion material.
Oh shoot, Amazon. I've got this monitor that if certain programs frustrate this monitor, and Amazon sometimes triggers it. Spotify does it all the time, but and I can't figure out what's with the driver of this monitor, that these certain programs are using a particular API that this monitor doesn't like. I just pulled it up there. No.
Yeah, it might be the codecs in that they're using.
I'm sure that's what it is. So,
okay, well,
this was great fun, Neal.
I've thrown out enough content for you to peruse over.
And now my monitors are acting. I've got to unplug this monitor, otherwise everything's going to get weird soon. It usually doesn't happen during a talk, but I just have to remember that Amazon is I got to be careful. I got to be careful with Amazon, because it's only that monitor. I can have it on the other monitors and it's fine, but it goes on this one. It's like annoying. Anyway, Neal, thank you for this.
Sure, and get better, because we need you back on the Freddie and Paul show.
Yeah, I don't know what poor Freddie. I don't know what he was able to. Well, it must have been pretty frustrated, but I should be back next Sunday. Truth be told, if I hadn't tested positive, and I probably just would have worked through this thing, because I work through colds all the time. But then it's like, is this going to be worse? I don't know. I'll just be cautious. We'll just have 1 week where I'll not be here. Everything will be all right. Anyway, O's is still runny. Well, thank you, Neal. It's good talking to you. And yeah, I will pray for your church shopping.
Okay. And I will look at the video, and I'll probably say it's okay, because I didn't really talk too much about my total depravity.
All right, I will send you the link.
Okay.
Okay, take care.
Okay. Have a good day. Bye.